Good day to everyone. So I'm Dr. Bataclan, and I will be discussing non-insulin anti-diabetic agents. Insulin and other analogs related to the medication is discussed in a separate lecture. So most of these agents are oral agents, but there are also some parenteral non-insulin agents that I will discuss in this lecture. So we will go first with drugs that would stimulate the release of insulin. So in this case, sulfonylureas and the meglitinides. So we'll go first with the sulfonylureas, in which its main effect is it increases insulin release. So they're only effective if the residual pancreatic beta cells are still present or relatively intact. So if you would remember in terms of the physiology, the stimulation of insulin secretion by the pancreatic beta cells, and later on, the predominant effect is a decrease in hepatic clearance of insulin. So what does sulfonylureas do is it binds to a specific receptor in the beta pancreatic cells, this SUR1, and it blocks the inflow of the potassium channels through the ATP-dependent channel. Therefore, the flow of potassium within the beta cell decreases. The cell membrane becomes depolarized, thus removing the electric gradient that prevents the diffusion of the calcium to the cytoplasm. Now, this increased flow of calcium into the beta cells causes the contraction of the filaments of actomyosin, which is responsible for the exocytosis of insulin, which therefore is secreted in large amounts. So it's possible that there could be impairment of the effect on insulin secretion that occurs during chronic administration of sulfonylureas, which could be due to downregulation of the SU receptors on the surface of the beta cells. This phenomenon disappears, however, after discontinuing the treatment for a period of time. In fact, resuming the administration of these drugs, the first administration effect again reappears. So, all sulfonylureas are absorbed by the intestine after oral intake, each one with its specific absorption time and bioavailability. Hyperglycemia can reduce the absorption of the SUs as it impairs intestinal motility. So therefore, it reduces the absorption of this class of drugs. The same phenomenon, of course, for food intake as well. So for this reason, to optimize the absorption of the drug, it should be taken 30 minutes before meals, and their dosage should be increased every 2 weeks if glycemic control has not been reached. So after absorption, the SUs bind almost completely to plasma proteins, especially albumin. On an average, a protein binding of 95%, and it could be as high as 99%, for example, for glibenclamide. The biological effect of these drugs often lasts much longer than their plasma half-life because of their receptor interaction, the formation of active metabolites, particularly the glibenclamide and glimepiride. The metabolites are produced due to the metabolization predominantly in the liver, and then the waste products or the byproducts are excreted predominantly in the urine, um, such as the tolbutamide, glimepiride, glipizide, and gliclazide. Among these, the tolbutamide, the chlorpropamide, and the tolasamide are the first generation SUs, while the others would be the second generation. The first generations are not currently recommended as a management for diabetes based on the current guidelines. Now, what are the recommended medications are the second generation sulfonylureas because they are more potent, no? About 100 to 200 times more than tolbutamide. So the first one would be glyburide, which is unique among the sulfonylureas because it not only binds to the pancreatic beta cell membrane receptor, but also becomes sequestered within the beta cell. This contributes to its prolonged biological effect, which could last about 24 hours, despite having a very short half-life of 1 to 2 hours. Glipizide, meanwhile, has the shortest half-life among the second-generation SUs. It has a good bioavailability, 100%. And again, food can delay its absorption. Compared with glyburide, the metabolites produced are inactive. So glyburide is one of the drugs preferred, no, in elderly patients and those with chronic kidney disease. Glimepiride, meanwhile, produces blood glucose lowering effect with the lowest dose among all the sulfonylureas. Its half-life is about 5 to 9 hours, but it also has a long duration of action of about 24 hours. So it can be given once a day. 60% of its metabolites are excreted by the kidney and the rest is eliminated through feces. Glycoside, meanwhile, it has a longer half-life of 10 hours, but its duration of action is much shorter than the glimepiride, so it's usually given twice a day. It has a 90% bioavailability, and it's also one of the drugs that has proven to have good outcomes, no, in terms of the cardiovascular and prevention of other diabetic-related complications. The most common side effect of this class of drugs is hypoglycemia due to the aforementioned mechanism of action. Weight gain is another adverse event that's common in sulfonylureas, though it can be mitigated if the patient is given metformin, which I will discuss later. Other infrequent side effects that may occur include nausea, skin reactions such as erythema multiforme, exfoliative dermatitis, and rarely photosensitivity. They can also cause abnormalities in liver function tests, which could lead to cholestatic jaundice, hepatitis, and hepatic failure, although the frequency is rare. Previous studies also noted that although I mentioned earlier that glycoside has a good outcome in terms of cardiovascular events, um, most of these sulfonylureas shown to have had higher risk of cardiovascular events. But in recent trials, it has showed no significant difference compared to the other classes of oral diabetic medications and even showed a decrease, no, as I mentioned, in cardiovascular events, particularly uh, glycoside in the advanced trial. The next drug would be meglitinides. So, repaglinide is the first member of within this group. No, these are also insulin secretagogues. They modulate beta cell insulin release by regulating potassium influx through the potassium channels that is similar to the sulfonylureas. They have a certain overlap in terms of the molecular site of action, because the meglitinides have two binding sites, which is common with the sulfonylureas, and a one different unique binding site. It also has a fast onset of action, could be as early as 1 hour after intake, and the duration would on average would be about 4 to 7 hours. Meglitinides are rapidly absorbed with the maximum serum concentrations, generally attained within 1 hour, and quickly metabolized by the cytochrome enzymes, particularly the CY3P A4 and the CYP2C8 pathways that produces inactive metabolites. So therefore, it has a shorter duration of action as compared to the SUs. And these drugs are more effective in reducing postprandial glucose levels. They're also given before meals because of the bioavailability. But caution that this drug should not be given if the patient will plan to skip a meal because of its intense glucose lowering effect immediately. The pharmacokinetics of meglitinides differ with nateglinide because nateglinide would have a much more faster onset, even as early as 20 minutes, but a shorter duration of action, about 3 to 4 hours. A D-phenylalanine derivative, nateglinide stimulates early insulin release faster and to a greater extent, with insulin levels returning to baseline levels more rapidly. Similar to SUs, it can cause hypoglycemia but the risk of severe hypoglycemia is less compared to the SUs. It's also important to note that these drugs are also contraindicated for individuals with impaired liver function, since the metabolism and excretion of this class of drugs is predominantly through the hepatic pathways. Now, a different type of action for non-insulin anti-diabetic drugs is those drugs that can act on the liver, the muscle, and adipose tissues, which are the peripheral organs, no, that are involved in the glucose metabolism. So, biguanides would be the most uh, old drug that is a part of this action, and metformin, which is a synthetic analog of guanidine. Therefore, hence the term biguanides. This is the most widely prescribed oral agent because it's low cost, and then there's already a proven efficacy for a very long time. Even before, when I was a medical doctor, metformin has become is already a staple in the management of diabetes and continues to do so until present. Um, it could be given as a monotherapy or it could be given as a combination with other agents. The major mechanism, no, of the hepatic effect of metformin, of course, or originates from its mitochondrial action. So remember, metformin mediated ETC, complex 1 inhibition that suppresses ATP production here, which leads to an increase in the cellular AMP and ADP levels. Therefore, it alters now the AMP to ATP ratio. In fact, even modest decreases in ATP production can result in relative increases in the AMP or ADP. Now, going back, because of that increased AMP, there is now a activation of AMPK, which promotes catabolic reactions that generate more ATP and inhibit energy-consuming anabolic pathways, including gluconeogenesis. And then alternatively, because of the increased AMP levels, it can participate in the inhibition of gluconeogenesis via the allosteric regulation of the key enzymes in this pathway. So, AMP can synergize with the fructose 2,6 bisphosphate, which would stimulate phosphofructokinase and inhibit fructose 1,6 bisphosphatase, this one. Another signaling pathway that metformin may interfere with is the generation of the cyclic AMP, and it blocks the um, CAMP PKA pathway, this one. So, metformin affects hepatic metabolism by inhibiting the mitochondrial ATP production. Now, the decrease in ATP production could decrease hepatic gluconeogenesis. It inhibits, again, as I mentioned, yung fructose 1,6 bisphosphatase, which is a key enzyme in gluconeogenesis. It can also decrease fatty acid synthesis and increase fatty acid oxidation. Now, these changes would lead to improvement in hepatic insulin sensitivity with decrease in serum triglyceride levels. In the intestine, metformin now increases anaerobic glucose metabolism in the intestine, resulting in increased intestinal glucose utilization and decreased glucose uptake into the circulation. The drug has recently been found out to also increase GLP-1 secretion, which could increase insulin secretion and decrease glucagon secretion. And this could also contribute to a weight loss effect, no, that is common in metformin. And finally, metformin can also affect the gut flora, which may alter glucose metabolism. I will further later discuss GLP-1, no, as part of the incretin system, which is also a part or a major mechanism in the glucose metabolism and homeostasis. So metformin, going back, metformin has a half-life of 1.5 to 3 hours. It's not bound to plasma proteins and is excreted by the kidneys as the active compound. As a consequence, no, of the metformin's blockade of gluconeogenesis, remember, gluconeogenesis involves the use of other non-glucose sources as a source of energy. And one of these would be lactic acid. So because of the impairment of gluconeogenesis, the metabolism of lactic acid is also decreased, which may lead to um, increased buildup of lactic acid in the bloodstream. Also, inhibition of the complex 1 no, in the mitochondrial respiratory chain reduces the ability of the mitochondria to recycle and intracellularly buffer hydrogen ions produced by ATP hydrolysis. So this also contributes to um, another pathway of causing acidosis, particularly lactic acidosis in patients taking metformin. So this is very important, particularly in patients with renal insufficiency, because these individuals are more predisposed to lactic acidosis. But this lactic acidosis, you should remember, is a dose-related complications. Um, Most of these lactic acidosis incidences have occurred in US, wherein the dosages of metformin is relatively high compared to the standard dosage of metformin that we use locally. Locally, the maximum dose of metformin given is 500 milligrams, a tablet for 3 times a day. So that's about 1.5 grams per day. But in the US, in other Western countries, they would even give as high as 3 to 4 grams of metformin a day. And for individuals, especially with chronic kidney disease, and those individuals also who has a critical illness, for example, wherein there's also increased production of lactic acidosis due to the pathogenic pathways related to the critical illness, it worsens or it aggravates and causes severe lactic acidosis in these individuals. Still, despite that worrisome effect, again, this is not a very common uh, adverse event no of metformin among diabetic patients, even in patients with CKD, as long as there is a dose adjustment that is given among these individuals. So this is still used as an initial therapy in conjunction with lifestyle changes. It can also reduce the glycosylated hemoglobin significantly, about 1 to 2%. This is independent of the age, weight, and the duration of the diabetes. But again, it's very important that there is a residual beta cell function among these individuals. So, because it won't work, because it just increases the sensitivity of the body to the insulin. It does not produce insulin itself, no? Uh, so that's the difference of these medications as compared to the insulin and the insulin analogs that are discussed in a different lecture. There are other beneficial effects of metformin as well, like weight loss, decreased cardiovascular events, lower triglycerides, and the low density lipoprotein. The most common adverse events, meanwhile, are diarrhea, nausea, abdominal discomfort, which can occur in about half of patients. But taking it with food or using the extended release form can ameliorate the symptoms. There are also some studies that have shown that metformin increases the risk of vitamin B12 deficiency. So sometimes physicians also prescribe vitamin B complex if metformin will be started, particularly in elderly patients. Um, this is contraindicated if um, the chronic kidney disease is in advanced stages, if the patient has a liver disease, acute unstable congestive heart failure, alcohol abuse, or other conditions that would have acidosis, such as most of the critical illness. Um, it should be withheld before the iodinated contrast imaging procedures, if particularly if the patient would have a stage 3 or stage 4 CKD, which is defined as an estimated GFR of 30 to 60 ml per minute in patients with setting of the liver disease, alcoholism or heart failure, or if an intra-arterial contrast would be used uh, as part of the imaging procedure. Another class of drugs that acts on the liver, muscle, and adipose tissues are the ligands of peroxisome proliferator activated receptor gamma, or the PPAR gamma, which are found in the muscle, fat, and liver. So the PPAR gamma receptors modulate the expression of the genes involved in lipid and glucose metabolism. It's also involved in insulin signal transduction and adipocyte and other tissue differentiation. So these PPARs bind as heterodimers with the 9-cis retinoic acid receptor, the RXR, as it is called, and a multi-component co-repressor complex to a specific response element called the PPRE. Once the PPAR gamma is activated, the co-repressor complex dissociates, allowing the PPAR retinoic acid receptor heterodimer to associate with a multi-component co-activator complex, resulting in an increased rate of gene transcription, as you can see here, which leads to insulin production. So, again, this receptor is highly expressed in the adipose tissue, although it's lowest in the skeletal muscles. In the liver, PPAR gamma expression is also relatively low, but increases in cases of obesity. So, these drugs, the thiazidinones particularly, would directly affect, would be beneficial, in obese patients. It is likely that the primary effects, of the thiazidinones, are on the adipose tissue, followed by the secondary benefits on other targets of insulin. These TCDs promote fatty acid uptake and storage in the adipose tissue, resulting in the decrease, of circulating fatty acids and a decrease in fat accumulation in the liver, muscle, and pancreas, which lead to the protection of these tissues from the harmful metabolic effects of high levels of fatty acids. Now, decrease in fat accumulation in the liver and muscle also would lead to an improvement in the insulin action, and the decrease in the pancreas would improve now the insulin secretion, as you can see here. The drug increases its expression in circulating levels also of adiponectin, okay, which is an adipocyte-derived protein which has an insulin sensitizing activity. So again, the end effect would be improved insulin sensitivity, particularly in the peripheral tissues. Okay. Pioglitazone has some PPAR alpha and also has the PPAR gamma activity. It is absorbed within 2 hours of ingestion, although again, food may delay uptake. So therefore, this is given also before meals. Pioglitazone is metabolized also by the liver through the CYP2C8 and the cytochrome P3A4 to active metabolites. It can be given once or twice a day. Another TZD would be rosiglitazone, also rapidly absorbed and highly protein bound, also metabolized in the liver to metabolites, although in terms of its amount, it's lesser than the pioglitazone. It can be also administered once or twice daily. Clinically, these are the beneficial effects. It can decrease urine albumin excretion or proteinuria. So again, these drugs can be given in patients to avoid progression to CKD. It can also have a supplementary blood pressure lowering effect. In terms of lipid profile, rosiglitazone increases the HDL. But the problem is it also increases LDL as well. Pioglitazone, meanwhile, increases HDL and lowers serum triglycerides. Studies have also shown that lower cardiovascular events, by improving cardiac function, its metabolism, coronary vasodilation, regression of the LBH, and the decrease in blood pressure help lower cardiovascular events such as myocardial infarction or all-cause mortality among diabetic individuals given this drug. However, the downside of this drug is it can cause increase in body weight, which is due to an expansion of the subcutaneous fat depot, whereas the mass of the visceral fat remains unchanged or even decreases. The stimulation of the PPAR gamma in the subcutaneous adipocytes stimulates lipid accumulation. Another possible adverse event would be fluid retention due to increase, which also contributes to the increase in weight. And this is due to the activation of PPAR gamma in the renal tubules that increases expression of the sodium channels, the epithelial sodium channels that would increase sodium reabsorption. It's usually present in edema. The frequency of uh, bipedal edema would be around 7 to 8% of those taking the drug. The occurrences of both is reduced if the patient is also given an SGLT2 inhibitor, which is another class of diabetic medications, which I would also discuss later. Edema also improves if the drug is discontinued and if other diuretics is given. No? But the particular diuretics that would be more effective would be those that act on the distal tubules, like the spironolactone, amiloride, and triamterene, and even metolazone. Because of this, so patients with congestive heart failure, especially the severe one, the class 3 and class 4, are not advised to be given this group of drugs because it can worsen congestive heart failure due to the possibility of pulmonary congestion or pulmonary edema. In addition, it can also suppress bone formation and increase bone resorption, resulting in decreased bone mass that makes individuals susceptible to osteoporosis and pathologic fractures. Macular edema has also been reported that can cause blurring of vision or decrease visual acuity. This drug can also induce ovulation and it can also result in unplanned pregnancies. So those are the downsides of this particular drug, which led to its decrease in popularity of use as a management for diabetes mellitus. So continuing, now let's go to the drugs that affect the gastrointestinal glucose absorption, particularly the alpha glucosidase inhibitors. They are competitive inhibitors of the intestinal alpha glucosidase enzymes, as you can see here in this figure, that reduce post-meal glucose excursions by delaying the digestion and absorption of the starch and the disaccharides. It also increases the postprandial GLP-1 secretion and reduce glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide secretion, or the GIP, which again, I will discuss later in the incretin system. There are 3 drugs that are available locally. So it is effective in lowering postprandial blood sugar and glycosylated hemoglobin. It does not cause weight gain, and tendency for hypoglycemia is also uncommon. So acarbose is the first of this class. It can be started at 50 milligrams twice a day before meals, just before the meal, okay? And can be gradually increased to 100 milligrams 3 times a day. Miglytol therapy, meanwhile, is initiated at 25 milligrams and then increased to 3 times a day. It can be, the maximum dose would be about 150 milligrams or 50 milligrams in 3 times a day. Meanwhile, voglibose, which was discovered in Japan in 1981, after its isolation from a Validamayan on a culture media, the producing organism being the Streptomyces hygroscopicis. Starting dose would be about 0.2 milligrams 3 times a day, and the maximum dose would be 0.6 milligram 3 times a day. Since this is a drug that predominantly acts in the gastrointestinal system. Uh, Not surprisingly, the common adverse events would be GI symptoms, flatulence, diarrhea, abdominal pain, because of the undigested carbohydrate that is stuck, no, in the intestines and the colon, and that is then fermented into the short chain fatty acids, causing the production of gas in the within the intestinal lumen. The effects, though, tend to diminish with ongoing use because the chronic exposure induces the expression of the alpha glucosidase in the jejunum and ileum, increasing distal small intestine glucose absorption and minimizing the passage of carbohydrate into the colon. So now related to this one would be now the drugs that affect the incretin system. So now incretin effect, no, refers to a greater insulin stimulatory effect on the beta cells after an oral glucose load. The majority of the incretin effect, no, is due to two gastrointestinal hormones: the glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, or GIP, and the glucagon-like peptide 1. But the hormone which has a more predominant role here would be the GIP. GLP-1 has a number of biologic effects, no, other than increased insulin secretion. It suppresses glucagon secretion, delays gastric emptying, and reduces apoptosis of human islets in culture. Patients with type 2 diabetes have shown significant reduction of the incretin effect. No, that's part of the pathophysiology among diabetic patients. No? But GLP and GIP levels in the blood after meals are not reduced in these patients. But the incretin effect, meaning its ability to to maximize the actions of these two hormones, is decreased, although the amount remains similar, no, compared to non-diabetic individuals. So rather, decreased functional beta cell mass and resistance, no, to the effects accounts, no, for the decreased incretin effect, and therefore the glucose lowering effect. We should so GLP-1 is degraded by what you call the dipeptidyl peptidase 4 enzymes. Although there are still other enzymes that can also inactivate GLP-1, such as endopeptidase, which is also cleared by the kidneys. Um, However, the native, no, DPP-4 cannot be used as a medication. So therefore, there are analogs that were also made which acts similarly, which inhibits now the formation, the action, inhibits the action of the DPP-4, that would decrease now the degradation of GLP-1, therefore prolonging its action and increasing its potential incretin effect, no, in the intestinal area. So what happens? So in addition to improving insulin and decreasing glucagon, there are also other effects, no, of the GLP-1. It increases the satiety, so it makes the individual uh, feel full at a much earlier time, therefore reducing its food intake. It increases beta cell proliferation and decreases the apoptosis. Although the problem here would be there is an increased nausea, which could also contribute to the increase in satiety. It delays gastric emptying. It decreases, again, gluconeogenesis, but it increases insulin sensitivities in the adipose tissues. Okay. However, the GIP counteracts that, since it decreases the nausea, and it also has an additive effect in increasing insulin, although it has some action here that it increases glucagon also. It Incretin effect also decreases serum triglycerides and increases the lipid buffering capacity in the adipose tissues. So what are some of these GLP-1 agonists? So exenatide Okay, so this is the first generation um, GLP-1 agonist, which was derived no, from a Gila monster venom. It has a 43% structural similarity or homology with the native GLP-1. Uh, and it has a substitution in one of its amino acid that uh, makes it less susceptible to degradation by the DPP4 enzyme. This is available as a fixed dose pen. It is injected subcutaneously within 60 minutes before breakfast and dinner. So this is usually given twice a day. It reaches a peak concentration of approximately 2 hours, and the duration of its action is around 10 hours. However, again, because it's eliminated by the kidneys, it's not recommended if the patient would be on stage 4 chronic kidney disease or less than 30 ml per minute. There are also um, case reports no, that exenatide has been associated with immune-mediated thrombocytopenia or decrease in platelets. Lixisenatide is also a first-generation drug, but it's no longer available in the US. It's not also available locally. So what's more available locally would be the second generation um, GLP-1 agonist. First one would be the liraglutide, which is a soluble fatty acid acylated analog. Um, this time there's again replacement of some amino acids as compared to the native GLP-1 substance, in which lysine is replaced with arginine at position 34. It has a relatively longer half-life, about 12 hours, so it allows once a day dosing. Um, it is given at around 0.6 to 1.2 milligrams per day. Another drug would be the dulaglutide. This has it has two GLP-1 analog molecules no, that covalently link to the Fc fragment of the immunoglobulin, particularly immunoglobulin G4 in the humans. So because of this amino acid substitution, it is more probably the most resistant in DPP4 degradation among the second generation GLP-1 agonists, because the half-life of this one would is as long as 5 days. Therefore, this drug can be given once a week. Lixisenat, okay, so liraglutide is also available locally, and dulaglutide is also available locally. But the most popular, definitely among these GLP-1 agonists, would be the semaglutide or Ozempic, that brand. It has a half-life also of about 1 week. It has an alpha amino isobutyric substitution, which makes it again resistant to DPP4 degradation. Okay, and there is a fatty diacid chain also to lysine, which makes it highly protein bound, which also prolongs the drug's half-life. So this can be also be given once a week. It has become popular, as we know, because of its weight loss effect, particularly the SELECT study, in which there is a significant reduction of weight, about 10%. This is the reduction of waist circumference as high as 8 centimeters. Um, but note that based on the study, the drug was given for years. And um, again, majority of the metabolites is cleared by the kidneys here. So there's still some caution with regards to these drugs, particularly in patients with chronic kidney disease. The most frequent adverse reactions of this class of drugs would be nausea, which is can be as high as 40%, vomiting, and diarrhea. Because again, what I mentioned earlier in terms of its mechanism of action, the reactions are more frequent in higher doses. They may also increase the risk of pancreatitis. So it should be important that they would be advised to seek immediate care if they experience explain persistent severe abdominal pain, particularly in the epigastric area. Now, a different class of drug would be, again, as I mentioned, the DPP-4 inhibitors. So the drug that was available in the market or even locally was sitagliptin, which is given 50 to 100 milligrams once a day. It has a good oral bioavailability, about 85%. It achieves peak concentrations as early as 1 hour after intake with a good half-life of 12 hours. It's primarily excreted in the urine, so therefore dose reduction in CKD is advised. The same goes with the vildagliptin, but it has a shorter half-life, so therefore it's given twice a day as compared to the other DPP-4 inhibitors. Saxagliptin, meanwhile, is given orally. 2.5 to 5 milligrams once a day. It reaches maximal concentrations within 2 hours. It has a low protein binding and it undergoes primarily hepatic metabolism. But 75% of the metabolites are excreted by the kidney. So therefore, again, those adjustment is needed in those patients with chronic kidney disease. Linagliptin, meanwhile, is given also once a day, 5 milligrams. It also has a relatively long half-life of around 8 to 10 hours. So it can be given once a day. It is primarily excreted now by the bile. So this is unique in terms of all the DPP-4 inhibitors in which no dosage adjustment is required in patients with CKD. Vildagliptin, meanwhile, okay, as I mentioned earlier, okay, in addition would be given twice a day. Now, DPP-4 inhibitors are weight neutral, but it also can help in reducing blood pressure and triglycerides. Its main adverse effect would be predisposition to nasopharyngitis or upper respiratory tract infections. Another common adverse event would be hypersensitivity reactions like anaphylaxis, angioedema, and the severe exfoliative skin conditions like Steven-Johnson syndrome. A different class now would be the SGLT2 inhibitors. SGLT2 is a receptor found in the tubules. So particularly in the S1, S2 segment. So it's a low affinity, high capacity glucose transporter in the proximal tubules, which is responsible for the reabsorption of the majority of the filtered glucose. Although there's also an SGLT1 receptor. This is predominantly expressed in the kidneys, which is also involved in the absorption of glucose in the intestinal lumen. These transporters are capable of reabsorbing virtually all the filtered glucose when blood glucose levels are less than 180 milligrams per deciliter. But when the blood glucose levels are greater than this cutoff, glucose now is not reabsorbed by this receptor and it begins to appear in the urine. So patients with type 2 diabetes express a greater number of SGLT2 transporters in the proximal tubule than non-diabetic individuals. So therefore, there's an increased glucose reabsorption among diabetic patients. So that's why inhibitors are made so that, as I mentioned, there is a decrease in glucose secretion even with a higher number of SGLT2 receptors, and that would lead to elimination of the glucose via the urine. Therefore, a glucosuric effect that happens in patients taking SGLT2 inhibitors. The ability to inhibit SGLT2 is not dependent on insulin action. So this is not affected by insulin levels or even insulin resistance. So there are 4 drugs that are initially known The first one would be canagliflozin, given 100 to 300 milligrams daily. Um, and then dapagliflozin, which is the earliest approved drug. It can be given 5 to 10 milligrams also once a day. Empagliflozin, given 10 to 25 milligrams per day. And the ertugliflozin would be the much younger among the group, and it's given 5 to 15 milligrams per day. So you can see here the various oral bioavailability, and they have a relatively uh, long half-life, so they are given only once a day. Plasma protein binding is relatively high. Um, all are excreted renally and metabolized through the liver. And the one with the higher SGLT2 selectivity would be the empagliflozin. So theoretically, empagliflozin is said to be has a more glucose lowering effect, no? But uh, there's no current head-to-head studies of one SGLT2 inhibitor versus another that would prove, no, in terms of real clinical situation that empagliflozin has such better glucose lowering effect. Because what's more important would be here would be its reduction in cardiovascular outcomes based on the studies. So it has shown that SGLT2 inhibitors reduces the development of heart failure and cardiac-related deaths. It has also benefit in reducing the progression of the albuminuria. Therefore, it decreases the risk also of end-stage renal disease, which is a common complication among diabetics. But we have to remember that, again, this drug cannot be given, especially in patients with advanced chronic kidney disease. But this could be very beneficial if the chronic kidney disease uh, is diagnosed and identified at the earliest stages. So the major adverse events, no, related to SGLT2 inhibitors would be the increased incidence of genital mycotic infections and urinary tract infection, which based on certain studies, up to 10% of patients experience it. There are some cases of severe pyelonephritis and sepsis that would require hospitalization, but it has been mitigated, and the its beneficial effects, no, outweigh, no, the risk of these adverse events in terms of the SGLT2 inhibitors based on the current studies that are already published recently. And then there are also the other glucose-lowering drugs such as the pralimlintide, which is an islet amyloid polypeptide, or the IAPP analog. So IAPP, which is a 37 amino acid peptide that is also present in insulin secretory granules and is secreted with insulin. It physiologically acts as a negative feedback on insulin secretion. So IAPP also reduces glucagon secretion, slows gastric emptying by vagally mediated mechanism, and centrally decreases appetite. So all of this now contributes to a reduction in the plasma glucose. So this is unique in such that this drug is also approved for use in type 1 diabetic patients, no? But should be given in conjunction with insulin. It is rapidly absorbed after subcutaneous administration. It has a so this is parenteral, no? One of the parenteral medications, such as similar to the GLP-1 analogs given subcutaneously. Um, it has a short duration of action, which is around 2 to 3 hours only. It is metabolized and excreted by the kidney, but it has a good bioavailability. And this should be injected before eating. Um, its major adverse events would be hypoglycemia and gastrointestinal symptoms, nausea, vomiting, and anorexia, because of its effect, no, in the small intestine because it delays the absorption of the carbohydrates. Okay, Colsevelam, meanwhile, is another drug which is a non-absorbed polymeric LDL cholesterol lowering agent, no, that has a high capacity bile acid binding molecule. This drug was developed initially, no, as a uh, medication to lower down the bad cholesterol or the LDL. But it was found out later on that it also has um, a good effect in terms of improving its glycemic control by increasing the diacylglycerol conversion, which is stimulatory, no, in order to increase insulin sensitivity in the peripheral tissues. Um, they say that yun nga, no, it improves the incretin pathway also. It increases the GLP-1 and GIP concentrations. So it increases the incretin effect that would also improve in the glycemic control. It is related to the FXR, which is a nuclear hormone receptor that complexes with the RXR, which alters the expression of a large number of genes, which would now activates the intestinal L cells, which decreases proglucagon expression that would decrease GLP-1 production normally. But when this drug is given, it helps in increasing the GLP-1 gene expression and secretion. So it improves the incretin system as well. And adverse events, no, are rare and usually are again gastrointestinal in nature because of its mechanism of action. It's predominantly eliminated in the feces. So this is also one of the drugs that does not require any renal dose adjustment. Okay, I think finally, the other drug would be bromocriptine, which is a centrally acting dopamine D2 receptor agonist, which is uh, initially given as a treatment for hyperprolactinemia in Parkinson's disease. This is also a drug given as a fertility drug, especially for women with high prolactin levels. The drug was also discovered to improve glycemic control in patients with type 2 diabetes. So as you can see here, um, the effect, no, of um, bromocriptine is that it increases the morning hypothalamic dopamine levels. So it lowers the sympathetic nervous system activity. Um, it decreases the lipolysis, the lipogenesis, and the hepatic glucose production. That With that, it improves the glucose tolerance, it improves the insulin sensitivity, it lowers the free fatty acids, and improves the vascular pathology in diabetic individuals. It can be given as a monotherapy or in combination with other drugs. However, the drug does not increase insulin levels also. So, in the management of diabetes, remember again, most of these drugs are applicable to type 2. Still, the standard of care for treatment in type 1 diabetes would still be primarily be insulin. The reason is that the hallmark, no, in the pathophysiology of type 1 diabetes is the absent, no, or the near absent beta cell function and activity. In addition to hyperglycemia, insulin deficiency can also contribute to metabolic disturbances like hypertriglyceridemia, and worst case scenario would be yung ketoacidosis, no, that can cause tissue catabolism, and it could cause also severe uh, critical illness, no, among diabetics. So medications are just part of the overall management of type 2 diabetes. Healthy behaviors, self-management, education and support, and determining yung social determinants of the patient, no, and lifestyle changes as well should be included as part of the glucose lowering management. There should be a person-centered, shared decision-making approach that would guide in the choice of the glucose lowering medications in adults with type 2 diabetes. There should be an importance of giving medications that would be effective and that would achieve and maintain the intended treatment goals. But you have to consider also the effects in the cardiovascular, the kidney, weight changes, and other important comorbidities such as hypertension or dyslipidemia. You have also to consider the risk of hypoglycemia, the cost and the accessibility of the drug is also very important here. And individual preferences are also taken into consideration. So if you would see here, it all starts with history taking. So you have to determine presence of comorbidities, the clinical characteristics of the patient. The social history is very important here. What are the priorities of this individual? What is in terms of the diet and activity that this patient has? That might also affect the management of the diabetes. There are also psychological issues that you have to also contend with, such as motivation, depression, and cognition. And then again, yung social determinants, no? Because there are some medications that I mentioned here that are relatively expensive, no? Like the newer ones, like the GLP-1 agonist. They are relatively more expensive than the oral medications, such as metformin, for example. So you have to weigh include that as a consideration in choosing the right medication for the diabetes. So you have to also include take note of the weight goals. Definitely, you want, especially in obese patients, you want to also help to reduce weight because that would also lessen the metabolic related complications of the other comorbidities, the side effect profiles. The patient may have predisposition to hypersensitivity reactions on certain medications or food. So complexity of regimen. So the simpler would be much better because it would allow better compliance. Um, and then the regimen choice to optimize the medication use. And then again, the access, the cost, and the availability would be very important. So there should be a discussion, not just to the patient itself, but also to the family members and the relatives or the primary caregivers of this individual. So there should be a clear communication on what would be our goal in terms of reducing the blood sugar, the glycosylated hemoglobin, and also prevention, no, of the diabetes-related complications in these patients. So definitely the goals should be specific. You should tell the specific goals in terms of, again, lowering the weight by this much in a certain amount of time. So it's measurable. It should be achievable. No, while the guidelines may give you a particular recommended value, but it might be impossible, no, for a particular patient at that particular instance or given a specific period of time. So there should be a time bound element, no, in terms of with the plan and the objectives, no, in the type 2 diabetes management. And then you implement the plan and uh, emphasize the compliance, no, of the medication to the patient and to the family and caregivers. And again, very important, the lifestyle and health behaviors and the advice, no, on the potential adverse events of the medications that are given. And again, you should monitor uh, by follow-up, repeating the fasting blood sugar and other metabolic parameters, and determine if there's need to be a change, no, in terms of the medications, or there should be a re-emphasis, no, on the other aspects of the management of diabetes. So this flowchart now gives us a guide, no, on what medications can be given, no, depending on a particular clinical situation. Okay, I'll just ship here. Yeah. So again, very important here, the lifestyle changes, the self-management, education and support, and determining some uh, social factors of the individual. So there are two main goals, as I mentioned, no? So there should be a goal in terms of the weight reduction, if applicable, and the reduction in the glycemic indices, which is here in the right side. While on the left, there's an emphasis now on uh, reduction, no, of the risk of the development of diabetic-related complications, particularly renal and cardiovascular effects. So, but you have to now by history, you have not determined, no, if the patient has already the comorbidities, whether it's diabetes related or not. So, like for example, if patients would have atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or the patient may have indicators of high cardiovascular disease risk, such as uncontrolled hypertension, obesity, smoking, dyslipidemia. So, what is recommended if these patients fall into this category, they could be given a GLP-1 receptor agonist or an SGLT2 inhibitors. And then you would monitor the hemoglobin A1C. And if it is still above goal, you can add other medications, but um, if the patient was started with GLP-1 receptor agonist, you can add SGLT2 inhibitors, or you can add pioglitazone, or even other medications as well. In patients with heart failure, SGLT2 inhibitors been now the drug of choice as a as an oral medication for these types of patients. For patients with CKD or chronic kidney disease, so SGLT2 inhibitors are also the drug of choice, but in terms of us, no, in terms of the uh, nephrologist point of view, it's usually a SGLT2 inhibitor combined, no, with the metformin, which is adjusted definitely depending on the estimated glomerular filtration rate. But if the CKD is advanced, meaning it's less than 20 ml per minute, so that's about stage 4 CKD, SGLT2 inhibitors now are is now out of the question. No, so it can be a GLP-1 receptor agonist or even other medications that would have less impact, no, in terms of the meta excretion and metabolic aspects, no, of the kidneys. Weight management is very important, especially among the obese. So you can give now what are the drugs that are that would have benefits, no, in terms of reducing weight. So as I mentioned, no, Ozempic, no, the semaglutide and the tirzepatide, then the dulaglutide and the liraglutide, which are also GLP-1 agonists. Um, And then metformin and DPP-4 inhibitors are also very are good drugs, no. They're the more cheaper alternatives if we want to have weight loss, no. And so it's again in addition to um the exercise, diet, and other lifestyle modifications. And now you have very important to monitor the glycosylated hemoglobin and the fasting blood sugar. Some would even also monitor the postprandial glucose. So if the postprandial glucose, for example, would be elevated, also the alpha glucosidase inhibitors are good medications, no, that would help lower down the postprandial glucose levels. Okay, so in a nutshell, those are the non-insulin diabetes medications. So hope that this short lecture has given you an initial guide, no, on the pros and cons of the different classes of non-insulin anti-diabetic medication. So with that, thank you for your time and stay safe.